Hello there and welcome back to the Closet Historian and back to my sewing parlor for a little crafting project. Let's face it, I'm not ready to dive into anything too complex after stenciling that entire room beside us. I'm still sort of physically and mentally exhausted, so I think it's probably best if I just sit myself in my little sequining station chair and focus on something small for once. Plus, we've been stuck in the 90+ degree heat here for days in midsummer, and I'm ready for fall. And to that end, looking forward to spooky season, of course, I think it's time I gave sequining a very specific species of moth a try. But I'll show you exactly what I mean as we dive on in.
Yes, it's time to go ahead and try and create a death's head hawk moth, which is most associated with the African death's head hawk moth, but there are actually 3 different species that are given this name. And for some reason I was having trouble sketching on this particular day. Again, I am a little bit worn out, so I went ahead and just printed out this moth on my little home printer using Microsoft Paint, traced a copy of that on some white paper here, and I'm just going to trace the cutout of the moth itself here onto my stiffened black felt. This is just black craft felt. There's usually like a soft variety and a sort of almost starched, papery feeling felt that they have in the craft aisle at the Michaels. I don't know what you've got in the craft store near you, but this is what I've got. It's not expensive in the least. This is not fancy wool felt, it's just the crafty acrylic stuff. But I went ahead and traced my sort of half-at-rest moth onto the felt here, and then I'm just going to cut a couple of spare pieces of felt into padding to go ahead and pad up the body of this guy. This is rather a juicy moth. I think if you were like a large bat, or I don't know what other creatures eat moths, but many, presumably, that one of these hawk moths would be a pretty good meal, unfortunately, for them, I suppose, which is why moths tend to be furry, because it helps. It's like sound foam for the moth, so it helps them be quieter, so that hopefully they can fly by without becoming something's meal. I'm just going to add these little additional pieces of felt to help pad out both the abdomen and the thorax here. And then with tiny sequins, these are 2mm sequins in a light ivory sort of pearl color, I'm going to go ahead and start filling in a little mushroom shape on the thorax. And this little shape I'm filling in here will be what becomes the skull on the back of the thorax, of course, of this very particular species of moth. And these moths have always been recognized as having a little spooky skull on the back of them, although of course the moths are not in any way a danger to humans or an omen of death of any kind, because they're just moths and they don't know that they have a skull on the back of them. And often it doesn't look exactly like a skull once you look closely, but it's one of those like impressionist painting sort of things, like all little tiny dabs of color. When you're looking very up close, it just looks like the scales of the moth. And then the farther away you get, the more you start to see a skull on it. If you squint a little, depending on the particular moth or the particular species, it's more or less skull-like. But humans tend to find faces in anything anyhow, so it's no surprise that we marked these as skeletal from the start. But I'm just using black Gutermann all-purpose thread, a single strand of that on a beading needle, to create the base shape of my skull. And the way to make this look like a skull is very simple. I just need to stitch on 2 black sequins to serve as the eye sockets, and bam, this little sort of mushroom shape becomes a skull. So I'm just going to stitch on a size 4 black matte sequin, and then secure that on with a seed bead, size 15 seed bead. I'm just slipping that on, and I'll slip the needle back through the sequin. The bead will hold it into place, sort of like a little rivet, and just like magic, we now have a skull instead of a mushroom. So I started with the skull, knowing that that was going to be, the main feature of this little pal here. And then for the rest of the thorax, I will go ahead and use some slightly cupped size 5, maybe these are size 4 or 5 sequins. These are in a matte black finish or a satin finish. Sometimes you can find fully matte sequins. Most of the time you can find satin, which do still have a bit of a sheen to them, but much less so than like a regular glossy or metallic sequin. And like I've said before, I do pick up most of my sequins from Cartwright Sequins. I can link them below. Not sponsored, but they do have every size, color, and finish of sequin you could ever desire. But despite my having a rather large collection of sequins at my disposal, I did not have the right kind of orangey yellow color of bead to do the abdomen stripes on this little guy. So I ended up going with a brighter, more pumpkin-y orange. So I sort of increased the saturation of this particular moth. I was looking at my reference photo of an actual one of these moths posed on a piece of tree, and it was a much more naturalistic color scheme, but I decided to go ahead and enhance. So instead of keeping with the exclusively natural tones, just because of the different colors of tila beads I happen to have in stock, I went with this brighter orange. And I will be stringing on a series of tila beads to create the abdomen stripes for this buddy. The center stripe down the center of the abdomen here, I will be using a matte kind of gunmetal color, and then a slightly oil slicked version of that half-size Tila bead interspersed with 2 quarter black matte Tila beads. Again, these are a specific type of bead from Mayuki, which is a bead manufacturer out of Japan, and I can link to these below as well. I like picking these sorts of beads up on Etsy. They can be a little bit expensive because there are some trendy bracelets made out of them, but I like using them for bead embroidery and projects like this. And I always say I think they should be called Tila beads instead of Tila beads because they look like little tiny pieces of tile. And I will be using them like mosaic tile here to create the abdomen of my hawk moth today. But I am just using Gutermann thread on a beading needle still to string these on here. These beads do have 2 holes in them, so I need to string down one side, sort of like the left and the right, and then come back up the other. And then I will go ahead and couch these down, which is just where you come back up through the back of the felt, take a stitch over your initial like stringing stitching, and back down into the material. Oh no, that's very hard to explain. As usual, I'm finding a physical process difficult to explain with actual words. But if you have seen any of my other bead embroidery videos, hopefully by this point you know what I'm talking about. Couching, it sort of looks like this. I'll try and find a free image on Google to show you here. But as I am stringing the left-hand side of the abdomen here, I'm keeping the same black stripes in line with the first string of beads, so that the black stripes will go around the entire abdomen when I'm finished. But I have switched over from the gray beads to the orange, just again referencing the actual moth this time, which is not something I usually do. Usually I'm making up my beetles and moths. They're sort of fantasy versions. But this time I was really trying to make an impression of the actual species of moth, so I was keeping the images nearby. I have my phone here as well to reference, like, where do their little leggies go? How often are these more orange or more black, depending on the different coloring and the different species? So I was referencing this moth closely, but not militantly as I was going along. But I did use Tilas to create the entire abdomen here. I would have gone for a like slightly fuzzy and properly turkey stitched embroidered abdomen on this, but I didn't actually have any black embroidery floss in my stash right now, so something to solve next time I'm at Michael's. Hopefully I will remember to grab some black embroidery floss because it's weird that I don't have any more laying around. Probably used it for something else. But just stringing on the beads I want, and then going ahead and stitching back up from the back and couching everything down so it's held into place. Of course, just the string of beads on its own would be rather floppy, so you kind of have to take stitches over the brickwork you've laid down to stitch it down to the underlayment, as it were. But with that completed, I just wanted to fill in the last little bit of the shape at the end of the abdomen here, just using some orange seed beads. These are probably like a size 10 seed bead, which is kind of a weird size. Usually use 11. Again, seed beads do have sizes. Trust me, I buy them online all the time, and I prefer to use 11 and 15, which are small and tinier seed beads, but these, I just happen to have orange seed beads that were a little bit larger, so I sort of stuck with that, and just finished the last either side of the abdomen with a row of seed beads, again coordinating the stripes with what I had already put in place with the Tila beads. And then because the smaller, like the underwings of this guy, are mostly orange, I switched over to some orange, again, Gutermann all-purpose thread. I just use sewing thread for this, nothing particularly special. Threaded a single strand of that onto my beading needle with a knot on the end, and I will start stringing on my sequins and laying those in size order and in differing colors to create patterns on the bottom wings of this, and on the top wings later on, but for now, working on these smaller underwings as it were. And again, these will be in the orange color range. I was kind of dipping back into the more yellowy orange, kind of ochre colored sequins because that would be more accurate to the actual bug, but I did mix in some of the more red orange, Halloween orange, pumpkin orange bits in here as well, just again to tie it back to the abdomen because I didn't want it to stand out as different. I kind of was trying to incorporate everything and just make this look like a, again, highly saturated version of the actual moth. And again, the key here when painting with sequins like this, in the same way that you would kind of color with embroidery thread, here all I'm doing is really, painting with sequins. So I have a bunch of different options laid out in front of me in different sizes so that I can choose as I go along what feels best next in the row, so I can create a dappled look, make it look like scales, make it look a little bit modeled like the actual, usually moth's wings do. So I'm switching between satin finish and transparent and iridescent sequins depending on what I'm looking for in the moment. I have some metallic sequins here that I'm mixing in, some glossy black sequins when I'm looking for something that is perfectly dark. And I'm using the black sequins sparingly so that I can create little stripes across the wings as I go along. Of course, having a rather large rainbow, a large variety of sequins at my disposal does help in doing this, but I always find that having a restriction actually usually increases like the creativity. Like you have to find creative solutions to things if you don't have every color. So for example, if you just didn't have any orange sequins at all, if you went every other with red and gold, it would look like orange from far away. So you kind of have to find different solutions, and sometimes getting creative like that when you don't have a specific color or size can lead to fun discoveries. So while, like for example, I wanted to do something originally different for the abdomen of this, but it did come out looking quite juicy and puffy like an actual moth does, which forgive me for calling the moth juicy. Again, I don't eat moths, but something does, and I think when a big one like this flies by, it does have similar, thoughts probably as I do about a nice strawberry. So do forgive me, but again, yeah, sometimes a different solution than you were anticipating actually ends up working out better than you could have expected. That being said, however, I am always falling for new sequins and adding to my stash. As we know, I have an entire cabinet, secretary desk full of sequins and beads at this point because I am me. And therefore just a little bit of a weirdo, both when it comes to talking about moths and when I'm discussing the finer points of collecting sequins. I will go ahead and fill in the top wings in this same way. The sequining work actually is what goes the fastest on these. It's actually very useful. I'm just creating rows or stripes of sequins here, then again, changing the color or slipping in a couple of different finishes as I go. For the top wings here, I'm going to keep things mostly matte black, but slip in a couple of glossy black, a couple of different metallic sequins, and a few white sequins, just strategically placing those where it looks like they would mirror or kind of mimic the different striations of the actual wings on this particular moth. And layering sequins like this I think is really good for especially creating fish, which I have done. I have created a koi fish brooch before, so you can see that here. But again, also butterflies, Lepidoptera, butterflies and moths also do technically have scales on their wings, so I feel like this is a good mimic of that as well. But I really do just stitch these down in rows. It's incredibly simple, and I do get into quite the little groove. This is my favorite part of doing a project like this, is the sequining section of it all. Long rows of sequins, in this case filling in shapes with those rows. And it's again changing and grading the sizes and the colors of these that allow me to fill in different shapes like these wings. And I actually did venture over to Hudson, New York with my mom while she was visiting this last week after I made this brooch, and I saw a bunch of the Trove Lore brooches out in the wild, my favorite brooches that inspired me originally to start making my own versions as well. They're usually about, 1/3 the scale of the nonsense that I make, but they are done with 1/3 the scale of sequins and beads and stitches as well. They are fine couture work, so if you want a brooch like these without having to do any of the work, check out Trove Lore. They are, again, I always say the couture version of what I make here. Again, not sponsored. Nothing on this channel ever has been, so you would know. I just happen to love and clearly admire their work. I'm not sure if they've done a death's head moth before. I'll have to check out what they did for their version. But I have my 1/4 wing finished here, filled in with, again, mostly those black matte sequins. I can link to those below on Cartwright's. Again, grading the sizes from tiny to large to fill in the wing shape. And I will mimic everything I did on the first side on the second. It's always easier to do the second side because I'm just copying what I did on the first side. Though you don't have to, of course. Your wings could be different colors, which does even happen in nature. As sometimes a butterfly or moth does come out a little bit different. And sometimes you'll have a male-female split, which is very interesting and possible in nature in many species, including Lepidoptera. Biology is always just, sort of doing its best and coming up with new variations on things, which is how evolution happens in the first place. So while I'm trying to mirror what I did on the first side, if it's a little tiny bit off, I don't tend to mind. When mimicking nature, too much perfection is never actually a good thing. And after I finished up my wings, aka again the fast and fun part, I just wanted to finish off the head of this buddy above the thorax here with our where our skull is hanging out, because the skull isn't this guy's face. He has his own face, you know? So I ended up actually stitching on some bright red cupped size 5 sequins to serve as eyes up here, but I didn't want them to be, you know, so googly on the top of his head, so I actually ended up putting more of the black matte sequins on top of these to hide one side of the round sequin so that I had a little half circle eye left over on these guys as well. So I'm going to stitch on these bright red eyes onto his head, and then I'll stitch on some black sequins on top of those and layer that right on top of there. You can stitch sequins on sequins if you want to. Just keep stitching, you know, sequins on sequins on sequins. Why the heck not? And then I decided to be good and start putting some of these things away. I think of having sequins all laid out around me, or beads all laid out around me as I work on these things, like having a palette of watercolors. You know, I never exactly know when I might need to dip into one color or another. So I try and have everything laid out in little piles around me. And then I end up, you know, only reaching for 7 out of the 17 options I have laid out. So I try to remember to put the rest away as I go, put them back into their little containers, slip things away from the work area so that things don't get spilled, so that things don't get any messier than they already clearly will just from being in my hands, in my area, in my zone, I suppose. But it is at this point that I'm finished with my initial beading and sequin work, and I can go ahead and cut off the extra felt here. So I'm very carefully using a tiny pair of scissors, cutting around the work area of my beadwork piece here, or embroidered piece, whichever we want to call it. It's embroidered with sequins as opposed to being embroidered with thread, which there's still thread stitching, as you can see on the back. So I'm being very careful not to cut through any stitches as I do this. But of course, felt, either wool or acrylic felt like this, does not fray. So that is the main reason to use this. You can also use leather for something like this. I just don't happen to have leather laying around. And by the end of the project, none of the felt is seen, so I find it a good, inexpensive, and easy to work with option. I did cut a few little tabs around the head here just so that I could fold those to the inside and keep the head a little bit puffier. And I'll take a few stitches into that, secure those tabs on the back with a few stitches here. I do have my thread doubled now on a thicker needle. I switched from a beading needle to a regular sewing needle here just for the stability of it. A beading needle is very, very thin, which helps it go through tiny beads, but it is also very bendy because of that. So I wanted something a little bit more robust as we work on the legs, the antenna, and finishing this buddy off, which I grabbed some stiffer copper wire that I had laying around. I'm sorry, I do not know what gauge this is. I'm guessing like 18 maybe, 18 or 16 gauge wire. Couldn't tell you, sadly. It's mysterious copper wire floating around in my stash. At some point when you have enough crafting stuff, it all starts to blend together unless you have very specific areas of knowledge like I do for sizes of seed beads, etc. But I've just cut about 1.5 inch long piece of that copper wire, and you saw I was using these purple handled pliers here to flatten the end of this wire, kind of create my own head pin. So I kind of smushed one end of the wire so that a bead wouldn't slip off the end, slipped on one matte white glass seed bead to serve as like the little white fuzzies at the end of the antenna here. Then I'm grabbing some gold work thread, which conversely is black in this case, and that being a tiny little coil, I can slip on over my wire here to color it any color I want, in this case black. So I've cut a little 1/2 inch piece of that, slipped it on over the wire here, holds that bead into place. I can kind of bend these as I like. This wire is a little bit stiffer, it's not too soft, which is nice. I have tried to buy hard wire, but I find it still very soft, so I don't really know where I'm going wrong when it comes to buying wires, but whatever I have around is what I use. Again, I'm not too precious about this kind of thing. These are kind of throw the kitchen sink at it projects. And again, I think that leads to creative solutions as opposed to having everything that I could ever dream possible at my fingertips. Sometimes I have to kind of just make it up, and good things come out of that. Every once in a while a disaster occurs, but more good things come than disaster, I suppose. And I will go ahead and slip this piece of wire through some of the sequins of the head just to hold it in place. Sorry, buddy. Really just went in there with some minor brain surgery for the moth here. Slipped these antennas through some of the stitches of the sequins on the head, and I'm just going to go ahead and flatten off the other end of the antenna as well, so that that bead stays right there at the end of the antenna. I can kind of bend these and shape these to my liking now that it's in place. And you can always throw a couple of stitches to secure something like this. I am going to secure the legs down with stitches into the felt itself. And you can see I have like Google Images open looking at these moths to try and see how much of the legs really can be seen. Often none, but I am going to go ahead and have the tops of 2 little leggies sticking out above the wings and 2 little legs sticking out just below the bottom of the wings. Often you can't, again, see the legs underneath the wings on such a large winged buddy like this, so I think you can get away with skipping them, and they are a little bit fiddly and annoying to do, so fair enough. And to do the legs, I'm actually using a memory wire meant for making like children's bracelets. So this wire is a lot stiffer and really holds its shape well for the legs on my bug brooches or insect brooches at this point, just because it's harder to snag on other things. Like when I'm wearing the brooch later, when I have it pinned onto my clothes and I go to hug someone, I don't get one of the little insect legs stuck on them. You know, entomological problems that I have. But I just bend these little legs, sort of zigzag shapes here. Again, I'm using a couple of seed beads and some of that gold working thread slipped on over the wire. And I usually have these mirrored so that there's just like a crossbar holding the two legs together. And then I can stitch that crossbar down to the felt on the inside. So that's what I did with all 4 of the visible legs today. Hypothetically, this guy would have another set of legs underneath these wings somewhere that we just aren't seeing in the brooch version. You know, we don't need to put on extra leggies that aren't going to be seen. Again, I fully forgive you if you don't want to do the little fiddly legs at all. That's right. And then just to give this brooch a little bit of extra stability, despite using stiffened felt here, I am just going to slip in a little bit of buckram. This is a sized or like a glue stiffened cotton or paper mesh, I suppose. I guess that's what would be called. It's like a woven papery goop that is dried and therefore stiff. Like a starched piece of mesh, I guess, is my best attempt at describing buckram to those who have never used it before. It's actually quite difficult to find. You can usually find it from millinery shops online or in person if you're lucky enough to have hat making shops near you, in which case you really need to thank your lucky stars because most of us are not so fortunate. I bet I can get different kinds of buckram down in New York City, but of course I'm not going to drive 4.5 hours each way for buckram, sadly enough. My cats wouldn't appreciate having me gone that long. One day I'll make it to the garment district, I promise. Am I promising you or promising me? It's hard to say. But I just quickly whip stitched that buckram onto the back for stability here. The nice thing about these being sequined on the other side is you can always hide a stitch through the whole thing under a sequin, which is what I'm doing here as I stitch my pin back on. You could, of course, glue the pin back on or glue on a hair clip or whatever you wanted to attach this to. At this point, you could also just stitch this down to a garment itself or onto a hat, etc. But even if you do have a definitive idea of where you want to put one of these, it is nice to have them just be a pin back and then you can move them around later on. Why not have a repositionable death's head hawk moth, you know? And then finally, to finish this off, I'm going to use my initial template and cut out another piece of felt in the shape of my moth to finish this off and clean everything up along the back. Again, you often see people use a very thin leather for this. If I had some, maybe I'd try it. But seeing as I don't, I'm using what I've got and what is, again, readily available and inexpensive. So I will cut that piece of felt to size, and I'm going to try and see exactly where the two sides of my pin back like poke off the back or like lift off the back. And I will cut tiny slits in this piece of backing felt just where the start and end of the, or like the hinge and the catch of the pin back are. That way they can poke through this piece of felt and everything will be cleanly finished and look very professional in the back. Seeing as we all know I'm very professional. Not so much. If I were very professional, then I would be better at filming this while I'm making things and making sure my hands are always in shot, which, as evidenced by this video, is an area of video making I have a lot of opportunity for growth in. But to secure this last piece on cleanly, I am just going to stitch all the way around the outside edge here using a blanket stitch, which is where you kind of take a whip stitch and then loop your needle through the stitch one more time, which in black thread on black felt disappear entirely. And of course, none of this is seen from the outside either. So if, like me, your stitching leaves a lot to be desired because at this point you are impatient to finish, it shouldn't be seen from the outside, so no worries there. Oh no, my foot is very asleep. I was narrating to you while folded up like a pretzel in my chair, no surprise there. I never can sit properly. Only when I'm wearing, a dress that requires it can I sit properly. Otherwise, I am folded like a pretzel and usually sitting on one of my feet, and now I'm going to pay the price for this. Although after all the stenciling and painting I've been doing recently, I actually have been waking up with my hands half asleep, so I really do need to take a pause because I have calluses and my hands keep falling asleep from painting too much. So again, I must take a bit of a break from that, sadly enough. But actually, on my way back from taking my mom to the airport this morning, I stopped at the Barnes & Noble and finally picked up a couple of books that I've been meaning to read for a long time. So I think tomorrow I might take half a day of reading and just sit in the new living room now that it is finished and peace has been restored to my downstairs. I believe they call that relaxing, and I will give it a try.
And here is my finished Death's Head moth, or my first crack at it. I would like to give this another go. I think a fully folded moth and a one with the wings extended higher up might be fun. These Sphinx moths have such a lovely shape, so I think it's something I can play around with more in the future. And each moth does seem to have a very unique skull face on the back of it, although again, the moth itself does not know that it has a skull on it or something that looks like a human skull on it. I don't know what it thinks it's mimicking, but for us, it's very Halloween worthy. I know this was a simpler sequining project today, but I hope you still enjoyed seeing how this moth came together, and thank you as always for watching. And a huge additional thank you to my patrons who make my work and these videos possible. And as always, I'll be back with more sewing, vintage fashion, costuming, and crafting real soon, so I'll see you then. Bye!